The moment Adam Schiff suggested under oath that Tulsi Gabbard's views aligned with Russian interests, he gambled on a move that can end reputations. He talked like he was addressing another politician who would dodge, deflect, and play along with the usual script. Instead, he was facing a combat veteran with a long military record and a reputation for challenging institutional narratives. He also seemed to forget that the Director of National Intelligence is the one person in the room who can credibly say, on the record, what she can and cannot access. And once you make an insinuation like that in a live hearing, you don't get to call it harmless after the cameras have already captured it. Schiff arrived with the confidence of someone who had spent years speaking in absolutes while leaving himself room to retreat later. He had a practiced style: imply secret knowledge, let commentators do the heavy lifting, then pivot when the receipts show up. It's a familiar approach in modern politics, where tone can substitute for proof, and repetition can substitute for clarity. He appeared ready to run his lines, land his implication, and move on to the next segment of the show. He was treating the hearing like a stage, not a record. Gabbard came in treating it like a record. She carried herself like someone who has been briefed in rooms where mistakes have consequences, not just headlines. In front of her sat a binder marked at the highest classification level and a separate set of materials cleared for public discussion. That detail mattered because it signaled she wasn't there to wave mysteries around for effect. She was there to turn the conversation from vibes to verifiable claims. The hearing room itself looked like a moment designed for maximum attention. Seats were full, the walls were lined with people who had managed to get inside, and the cameras were positioned like it was a marquee event. C-SPAN went live, and the broader media ecosystem did what it always does when conflict is expected. It leaned in. Millions tuned in not because they love procedure, but because they love confrontation with consequences. And this was being framed as the new DNI facing scrutiny from a committee that had spent years at the center of political storms. Mark Warner called the hearing to order on time, the formalities were read, and the room settled into that familiar rhythm of Washington theater. Then Schiff took the microphone and put on the tone he uses when he wants the audience to hear urgency rather than nuance. He said the nomination had raised concerns, he referenced prior statements, and he framed her skepticism as something close to disloyalty. He leaned on the usual list of insinuations, the kind that sound damning even before anyone asks for evidence. And then he did the thing that changes everything, because once it's in the air, it's hard to pretend it wasn't said. He implied that her positions lined up suspiciously well with Russian interests and suggested the possibility of influence operations. He tried to cushion it by attributing it to unnamed professionals, the classic Washington move of outsourcing a punch. But the effect was the same, a nationally televised suggestion of compromised loyalty. The room went quiet, because even people who love political combat know that's a serious allegation. And on a committee about intelligence, words like that don't just float, they attach. Gabbard didn't flinch. She gave a small, controlled smile, the kind that reads less like humor and more like recognition. Her voice stayed calm, but the edge came through when she repeated his claim back to him with precision. She reminded him that he was speaking under oath, on the record, in a hearing that would be replayed frame by frame. Then she asked the one question that makes an insinuation either become evidence or become embarrassment. Do you have any intelligence that supports what you just implied? Not your interpretation of a TV clip, not a vibe, not a guess, not a "some people say." Any assessment, any report, any sourced intelligence that indicates I am compromised by Russia. Because if that exists, you should present it, and if it does not, you should explain why you said what you said. In a room built around classified information, that question lands like a gavel. Schiff shifted, and you could feel the pivot coming. He pointed back to public statements as if a disagreement on policy is the same thing as foreign control. But Gabbard kept the frame where he didn't want it. Evidence, not inference. She laid out the binary that makes politicians sweat because it turns rhetoric into accountability. Either the claim is real and supported, or it is not. And then we have a different problem entirely. The tension in the room wasn't just partisan. It was procedural, because hearings are supposed to be about claims you can stand behind. And it was cultural, because the public is tired of being told to trust someone's secret certainty. So she didn't let him glide past it, not even for the sake of moving on. She held him to the exact phrasing he used, because that's how records work. Then she widened the lens. She referenced earlier years when Schiff publicly suggested he had seen evidence of collusion that went beyond circumstantial. She didn't present it as gossip or memory. She presented it like a prosecutor organizing exhibits. Clips appeared, dates were cited, and the audience was reminded of how confident those claims once sounded. It's hard to argue with your own face on video, saying the thing you now want to rephrase. She pointed out that those statements weren't isolated. They were repeated across networks, across months, across the kind of airtime that shapes national narratives. The implication she drew was not that someone is evil, but that someone repeatedly spoke with certainty that later ran into reality. And she asked the question that voters ask when the camera is off and the spin is gone. If you were so sure then, what exactly were you sure about? At that point, the hearing wasn't just about her. It was about credibility as a currency in politics and who spends it responsibly. It was about whether "I can't share details" is sometimes a shield for "I can't back it up." And it was about whether the public is allowed to notice the gap between confident claims and final findings. Because the Mueller report exists, and people can read what it does and does not conclude. Gabbard framed it in plain language that doesn't require a law degree. If the report did not establish conspiracy or coordination, then why were Americans told that direct evidence existed? If the evidence was classified, why did it never later materialize in any form that matched the certainty of those statements? If it was never there, then what exactly was the public being sold for 2 straight years? And if it was there, why didn't the investigation find it? These are the kinds of questions that make the room uncomfortable because they don't fit neatly into party talking points. They force you to choose between admitting error and insisting that reality was wrong. They also force the media to confront the difference between contact and collusion, which are not the same thing. And if you say, "I can't discuss classified," the obvious response in that room is simple. She's the DNI, so you're not hiding it from her. Schiff's posture looked tighter as the exchange continued, and that's when the camera language matters. You can say all the right words, but the body language tells its own story. Gabbard's demeanor stayed controlled, almost clinical, like she was reading a report rather than trading insults. And that contrast is a nightmare for anyone relying on insinuation, because insinuation needs heat to survive. Receipts do not need heat, they just need light. Then she moved into another area where records exist, and where official reports have already left paper trails. She brought up the FISA controversy and how arguments were made at the time about whether abuse occurred. She referenced the Inspector General findings, emphasizing that this wasn't about a tweet or a cable segment. It was about documented errors and omissions in a process that carries enormous power over civil liberties. And she framed the question in a way that sounds almost unfair, because it feels so direct. If you reviewed the applications and defended them, how did you miss what the Inspector General later identified? If you didn't review them carefully, why speak with such certainty about what they did or did not contain? And if you did review them, and still said the opposite of what later findings described, what should the public conclude? That's not a question about ideology, it's a question about diligence and honesty. And those are questions that don't go away with a clever soundbite. At this point, the hearing started to feel less like a standard oversight session and more like a referendum on a style of politics. The style where you hint at something dark, let the audience fill in the blanks, and then act offended when asked for proof. The style where certainty is treated like evidence, even when evidence is complicated. And the style where the person demanding accountability is framed as the threat, just for asking the question out loud. If that sounds familiar, it's because the country has watched it play out for years. Gabbard's most effective move was refusing to match his tone. She didn't shout, she didn't insult, and she didn't turn it into a circus. She asked pointed questions, then waited long enough for the silence to become part of the answer. And she made sure the questions were framed in ordinary language, the kind people repeat at dinner. Why did you say you had evidence? And where is it now? That is the kind of line that travels. Not because it's clever, but because it's basic accountability. It also flips the usual hierarchy in Washington, where the loudest person is often treated as the most informed. Here, the quieter person looked more in control because she stayed anchored to the record. And that makes the other person look like they're arguing with gravity. If you're trying to build a viral political narrative, this is the moment the audience leans forward. Because the audience doesn't need to agree with her politics to understand the dynamic. They understand that insinuations are cheap and documentation is expensive. They understand that people who trade in "trust me" get nervous when confronted with "show me." And they understand that a serious allegation under oath is not a throwaway line. Here's the controversial question that hangs over the whole exchange. If you're going to imply someone is compromised by a foreign power, what level of evidence should you be required to present? Should insinuation be treated as protected theater or as a claim that deserves consequences when it collapses? If the public is told year after year that the evidence is there, what happens when the evidence never arrives? And if politicians can do that without penalty, why would they ever stop? Another uncomfortable question follows right behind it. When someone speaks with certainty about intelligence in public, who is supposed to verify it? The press that benefits from dramatic framing, or the committees that benefit from expanding their aura of secrecy? If the answer is no one, then what exactly is oversight supposed to mean in the first place? And if oversight becomes performance, what happens to public trust when the performance ends? Gabbard's posture suggested she understood something many politicians ignore. People aren't only watching the claims, they're watching the incentives behind the claims. They're watching who profits from drama, who fundraises off fear, and who never pays a price for being wrong. They're also watching who gets labeled dangerous for asking for receipts, and they're tired of being told that skepticism equals disloyalty. A little humor cuts through here, and it doesn't require cruelty. Schiff's "I know something you don't" expression works great until the person across from him can legally say, "I know everything you know." That's when the magic trick stops being magic and starts being awkward. And awkward is deadly in a room full of cameras, because awkward is honest. It's hard to look like the guardian of secrets when the other person is holding the keys. By the time this segment ended, the room had changed, not because anyone screamed, but because the rhythm of control shifted. Schiff tried to pivot into safer territory, the classic move when the ground gets shaky. But she had already set the frame. And the frame was evidence, not implication. And once the audience is trained to ask, "Okay, where's the proof?" the old tricks get harder to sell. The next phase of the hearing wasn't about who could deliver the sharpest line. It was about who could keep a straight face while the record got heavier and the room got quieter. Schiff tried to reset, to put the conversation back into the safe zone of broad principles and vague warnings. But Gabbard had already made the hearing about specificity, and specificity is where narratives go to die. If you've ever watched a politician try to outrun a spreadsheet, you know exactly how this part feels. He attempted the classic pivot: talk about oversight, talk about threats, talk about how serious everything is. Those phrases sound responsible on TV, and they give you room to avoid answering the thing you were just asked. But she didn't let him turn the hearing into a fog machine. She guided it back to a simple standard that plays well with viewers who are tired of being lectured. If you say it under oath, you should be able to support it on the record. She reminded the room that insinuations aren't just political flourishes when you're dealing with intelligence. They land on real people, shape real investigations, and stick in the public imagination long after the truth gets buried. Then she did something that made Schiff's staffers look like they wanted to crawl under the dais. She moved from general arguments to a sequence of documented moments where public certainty had outrun documented outcomes. And she asked questions that sounded almost too basic to be controversial, which is exactly why they were so effective. If an intelligence leader tells the public they have seen proof, what duty do they have to correct the record when the proof never arrives? If they never correct it, is that an honest mistake or a deliberate strategy? If it's a strategy, are voters being informed or being manipulated? And if voters are being manipulated, how is that different from the disinformation everyone claims to oppose? If you want a fight that stays within policy while still sounding brutal, that's the lane. Schiff tried to defend his earlier framing by talking about contacts and suspicious behavior. Gabbard didn't deny that politics can involve messy contacts and incomplete information. She simply refused to let messy become a license for confident claims that later dissolve. She drew a bright line between raising concerns and declaring, "You've seen evidence." Then she pressed the point with the calm tone that makes the other person look more frantic, the more they squirm. Her questions were framed like a courtroom, but her delivery was more like a debrief. She kept her phrasing tight, she kept her timing deliberate, and she let pauses do work. Schiff, by contrast, looked like someone trying to talk his way out of a label he had already attached. And the audience could feel the asymmetry because he was defending vibes while she was holding paper. That's when the hearing started to feel less like ideology and more like credibility audits. She moved back to the theme he opened with because she wasn't going to let him change the subject. He had implied she was compromised, and now the room was watching whether he could justify it. She made a point that sounds obvious but lands hard in a committee built around secrecy. If there is intelligence suggesting compromise, the DNI would have access to it. So either the intelligence doesn't exist, or someone is withholding it from the DNI, and neither option makes him look good. That's the kind of logic trap that doesn't require insults. It just requires holding the same standard for everyone, including the person making the accusation. Schiff tried to step around it with concerns and patterns, and she kept steering him back to evidence. It's almost funny in a dry way, like watching someone show up to a chess match with a deck of Uno cards. You can be loud, but the rules don't care. Then she broadened the critique into a bigger question that viewers love because it sounds like common sense. Why are Americans constantly told that certain claims can't be discussed because they're classified? But the claims are still made publicly anyway. If the details are too sensitive to share, Why are the headlines being fed to reporters in the first place? If the public is allowed to receive leaks that shape perception, why isn't the public allowed to receive corrections when those leaks mislead? And if that correction never comes, who is accountable and when? This is where she added the kind of humor that doesn't cross lines. She didn't call him names. She didn't accuse him of crimes in a way that turns into a content strike. She just pointed out the weird theater of people saying, "I can't tell you," right after they tell you exactly what to think. It's like someone saying, "I can't share the recipe," while handing you a plate and insisting you praise the chef. The room laughed lightly, because even senators understand when they're watching a familiar trick. Schiff attempted another pivot into broader threats, because broad threats are safer than narrow questions. Gabbard followed him there briefly, then snapped it back to what can be documented. She introduced the FISA controversy again, not as a partisan slogan, but as a question of civil liberties and institutional discipline. She framed it as something Americans across parties should care about, because surveillance power doesn't stay neatly in one political box. And she asked an uncomfortable question that sounds fair, which is why it hurts. If a committee leader defended the process publicly, what explains the gap between that defense and the Inspector General's later findings? Was the defense based on incomplete review, or was it based on protecting a preferred storyline? If it was incomplete review, why should the public trust future assurances? If it was storyline protection, why should the public accept lectures about disinformation from the same people? There's no clean exit from that set of questions, and that was the point. She then shifted to a moment in recent political history that is still emotionally radioactive. She discussed the laptop story and the letter by former intelligence officials, but she did it with careful language. She emphasized the distinction between saying, "You don't know," and letting the media treat your letter like confirmation. She asked why public authority was used to shape public perception without firm underlying evidence. And she posed the kind of question that triggers comment sections without requiring you to assert anything unprovable. When you sign something that you know will be used as a shield for censorship, what responsibility do you have for how it's used? If you say you have no evidence, but you still strongly imply foreign involvement, are you informing the public or steering it? If you are steering it, is that an intelligence assessment or a political act wearing an intelligence costume? If it's a political act, why shouldn't the public treat it as propaganda, not expertise? And if it's propaganda, why do the people who signed it still get presented as neutral authorities? Schiff's defense in this section sounded like the usual: concern, experience, pattern recognition. Gabbard's response didn't deny that experience matters, but she refused to let experience replace evidence. She framed it as a credibility issue, not a moral one, which is safer and sharper at the same time. She argued that in an information environment already poisoned by distrust, authority has to be handled like a hazardous material. If you spill it casually, you don't get to act surprised when people stop drinking the water. A few senators looked like they wanted to step in because the exchange was getting too consequential. But that's what happens when someone refuses to play the polite script. Gabbard's approach created a dilemma for the committee itself. If they let Schiff slide, it looks like double standards. If they rein him in, it looks like they're admitting he went too far. That's the moment the hearing stopped being about partisan advantage and started being about institutional legitimacy. Because if the Senate Intelligence Committee can't handle basic accountability in public, why should the public trust its secrecy in private? If the committee is comfortable with insinuation but allergic to documentation, what is it actually protecting? And if protecting democracy becomes a phrase used to excuse anything, does it still mean anything at all? Those questions are not comfortable, but they're the kind that keep viewers watching. Gabbard's tone stayed steady as she drew out the contrast between service and performance. She wasn't saying military service makes someone automatically right. She was saying military service trains you to respect facts, timelines, and the consequences of careless claims. In combat, you can't declare certainty and then revise it later without consequences. And she suggested, without melodrama, that Washington might benefit from a little of that discipline. Then she did what good interrogators do. She returned to the opening accusation again, almost like she was circling back to check whether the answer had changed. She asked if Schiff had any evidence now, after all the pivots and all the speeches. She asked if he could cite any intelligence product that supported the implication he put on the record. And when he couldn't, the absence became the headline even without anyone saying it out loud. This is where the funny detail writes itself, because the visual sells the story. Schiff's face looked like someone who had walked into a door he insisted wasn't there. His posture was rigid, his phrasing got more cautious, and his confidence started sounding like irritation. Gabbard, meanwhile, looked calm enough to be reading weather updates, which made the contrast even sharper. People don't need narration to spot who looks prepared and who looks exposed. Here's the controversial question that landed hardest in this section. If a senator can imply treason-adjacent claims under oath with no evidence and face no consequences, what does under oath even mean anymore? If the penalty for being wrong is nothing, why would anyone stop making dramatic claims? If the reward for dramatic claims is airtime and fundraising, why would anyone choose restraint? And if that cycle continues, does it strengthen democracy, or does it turn public trust into a burn pile? Gabbard didn't need to say the last part directly. She just kept asking questions that forced the audience to say it to themselves. And that is the safest way to deliver heavy content without stepping into strike-worthy territory. You lead the viewer to the inference instead of declaring the inference as an absolute fact. It's still provocative, but it reads as commentary built on the public record, not a reckless allegation. By the end of this phase, Schiff's attempts to steer the hearing felt less like oversight and more like escape routing. He was trying to talk about broad threats, but the room was stuck on one narrow problem. He had put a serious insinuation on the record, and he could not support it with evidence. And once that is visible, everything else sounds like background noise, because the audience doesn't remember every paragraph, but it remembers who dodged the basic question. By the time the hearing moved into its third act, the mood had shifted in a way no opening statement could undo. This was no longer a polite exchange between lawmakers and a nominee. It had become a slow-motion collision between accusation and documentation. And the most dangerous thing for anyone relying on implication is time. Because time invites scrutiny. The longer the exchange went on, the clearer it became who was prepared for scrutiny and who was not. Schiff tried again to widen the frame, invoking democracy, norms, and institutional trust. Those words usually function like insulation, thick enough to keep heat from reaching the speaker. But insulation fails when the source of heat is inside the room. Gabbard didn't challenge the words themselves, because that would have been too easy. Instead, she questioned whether the conduct on display actually matched the values being invoked. She reminded the committee that democracy is not protected by slogans. It's protected by accuracy, restraint, and the willingness to admit error. She pointed out that the public is not confused about complexity, only about contradictions. People can handle uncertainty when it's honest. What they resent is confidence that evaporates the moment someone asks for proof. Then she pivoted to something even more uncomfortable for Washington. She talked about the culture of selective leaking, but she did it without theatrical outrage. She framed it as an operational problem, not a partisan scandal. If classified briefings routinely produce anonymous leaks within hours, something is broken. And if that something is broken only when it benefits one side, people notice. She didn't accuse Schiff personally of typing messages to reporters. She didn't need to, because she focused on patterns rather than perpetrators. Closed-door meetings, followed by detailed press stories, don't happen by magic. They require access, timing, and intent. And when those stories consistently reinforce one narrative, the coincidence theory wears thin. Schiff objected, as expected, emphasizing how seriously he takes classified information. Gabbard didn't dispute his stated intentions. She questioned the outcomes. If the goal is protecting sources and methods, why do so many protected details show up in headlines? If the goal is oversight, why does oversight so often turn into performance? This is where her restraint became her weapon. She didn't accuse him of criminal conduct, which would have triggered instant defensiveness. She asked whether the system rewards the wrong behavior. If leaks help your preferred narrative, are they quietly tolerated? If leaks hurt your allies, are they suddenly a grave threat to national security? She posed a question that sounded almost philosophical, but it cut straight to power. Is intelligence supposed to inform policymakers or persuade the public? If it's the latter, who decides which persuasion is acceptable? If it's the former, why does so much intelligence-adjacent information get curated for media impact? And when does oversight become marketing? A few senators shifted uncomfortably because this critique didn't belong to one party. It applied to the entire ecosystem that feeds off selective disclosure. Gabbard made that clear by not naming names unnecessarily. She spoke in general terms that everyone in the room understood personally. That's how you make something sting without lighting yourself on fire. She then addressed the idea of patterns, a word Schiff had leaned on heavily. Patterns can be useful, she acknowledged, but they can also be abused. If you start with a conclusion, everything becomes part of the pattern. Disagreement turns into disloyalty. Skepticism becomes suspicion. And eventually, evidence becomes optional, because the pattern already feels right. She asked whether Washington had become addicted to pattern thinking at the expense of verification. If enough officials repeat the same suspicion, does it become true by volume? If a claim is amplified by enough outlets, does that substitute for confirmation? And if not, why does it keep happening? Those questions landed because they mirrored what viewers already feel but rarely hear said out loud. This is where a touch of dry humor slipped in again. She remarked that if repetition alone created truth, cable news would be the most accurate institution in America. The line drew quiet laughter, not because it was mean, but because it was painfully familiar. Everyone knows how narratives harden through repetition. Pointing it out doesn't make you radical. It makes you observant. Schiff tried to steer the conversation toward external threats again, emphasizing vigilance. Gabbard agreed that vigilance matters. She then added that vigilance without discipline becomes paranoia. And paranoia is not a security strategy. It's a liability. That distinction resonated because it framed skepticism as responsibility, not recklessness. She spoke about the damage done when intelligence language is used casually in politics. When words like asset or compromised get thrown around without proof, they lose meaning. Worse, they become tools for silencing dissent, rather than identifying danger. She asked whether the committee wanted to encourage that culture, and whether they were prepared to live with the long-term consequences if they did. The questions kept stacking, not in volume, but in weight. Each one was answerable in theory, but awkward in practice. Schiff responded with generalities which only highlighted the contrast. The more abstract his answers became, the more concrete her questions sounded. And viewers instinctively trust the person speaking in specifics. She then turned to the broader impact on public trust. Polls, she noted, already show declining confidence in institutions. Every time an official overstates certainty, that confidence erodes further. Every time a correction never comes, cynicism grows. And once cynicism sets in, even truthful warnings get ignored. This led to one of the most uncomfortable questions of the hearing. If people stop trusting intelligence warnings because they've been burned before, who bears responsibility? Is it the citizen who becomes skeptical, or the official who cried certainty too often? If future threats are real, will anyone listen? And if not, was the short-term political gain worth the long-term damage? Schiff attempted to counter by emphasizing his years of service. Gabbard didn't dismiss his experience. She questioned how that experience was deployed. Experience can guide judgment, or it can be used to intimidate critics. The difference lies in whether experience is paired with humility. She contrasted two models of authority, one that says, "Trust me, I know more than you," and one that says, "Here is what we know, here is what we don't, and here is why." The second model, she argued, builds resilience. The first builds dependency, and dependency collapses when the authority falters. The room was quiet again, not because anyone was stunned, but because the argument was hard to rebut. It didn't attack motives directly. It attacked methods. And methods are harder to defend when the outcomes are visible. You can argue intentions all day, but records don't care about intentions. She circled back once more to the opening accusation. She asked if Schiff wanted to clarify his words, not retract them dramatically, just clarify whether he stood by the implication. It was an invitation to de-escalate without humiliation. He declined it, choosing instead to move forward. That choice mattered, because once the chance to clarify passes, silence becomes its own statement. Viewers understand that instinctively. If someone offers you a clean exit and you refuse it, they assume you can't take it. And that assumption is rarely charitable. The third phase ended with a sense that something irreversible had happened. Not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, visible erosion. Schiff's authority in the room felt thinner than when he began. Gabbard's felt stronger, not because she dominated, but because she anchored. And anchoring is what people crave in a political culture that feels permanently unmoored. Here's the controversial question that lingered after this segment. If intelligence leaders can imply grave accusations without evidence and face no immediate reckoning, who is the system really designed to protect? The country, or the careers of the people inside the system? If the answer is the latter, how long can public trust survive? And if trust collapses, what exactly are we defending anymore? As the hearing moved deeper into its fourth phase, the dynamic was no longer subtle. The room felt like it was waiting for something to break, even if no one said it out loud. Schiff appeared determined to regain control, while Gabbard seemed content to let the record keep expanding. That difference in strategy mattered more than any single exchange. One side needed momentum, the other needed patience. Schiff attempted to reassert authority by leaning into the language of urgency. He spoke about threats to democracy, the fragility of institutions, and the dangers of complacency. These are words that usually stop follow-up questions cold. They create a moral high ground that's hard to challenge without sounding reckless. But Gabbard didn't challenge the words. She challenged their application. She asked whether invoking democracy should excuse imprecision. She asked whether protecting institutions means protecting their credibility or protecting their leaders. She asked whether trust is strengthened by certainty that turns out to be wrong. Each question sounded respectful, even restrained. But together they formed a critique that cut deeper than any accusation. She pointed out that democracy depends on informed consent. Citizens can't give informed consent if officials speak in absolutes and correct in whispers. They can't evaluate risk if every disagreement is framed as disloyalty. And they can't hold leaders accountable if those leaders are never asked to explain past certainty. Those statements didn't need a partisan label to land. Schiff responded by emphasizing intent. He spoke about his desire to protect the country and prevent foreign interference. Gabbard didn't dispute intent. She questioned outcomes, which is far less comfortable ground. Good intentions don't fix bad information once it's been broadcast. She returned again to the public record, not to dramatize it, but to normalize it. Records exist so we don't have to rely on memory or spin. They exist so future debates don't depend on who speaks most confidently. She reminded the committee that records outlast careers. And once something is on the record, it belongs to the public, not the speaker. This is where the exchange took on an almost educational tone. Gabbard explained the difference between assessment and assertion. An assessment weighs possibilities. An assertion declares conclusions. Confusing the two is not a harmless mistake when national narratives are at stake. It's a professional failure, regardless of party. She asked whether the committee wanted to reward that confusion. If officials face no consequence for overstating certainty, what incentive exists to be careful? If the loudest claims receive the most attention, why would anyone choose restraint? And if restraint disappears, what happens to real warnings when they matter most? Those questions lingered, unanswered, because they don't fit neatly into a soundbite. A brief moment of levity broke the tension. Gabbard noted that Washington often treats experience like a magic spell. Say it often enough, and no one is supposed to question you. She smiled slightly and observed that experience should make you more cautious, not more theatrical. The laughter was soft, but it carried. Schiff bristled at the implication, insisting that caution was exactly what motivated his concerns. Gabbard nodded, then gently pointed out the difference between caution and alarmism. Caution invites review. Alarmism demands belief. One builds resilience, the other builds dependency. And dependency collapses the moment the authority figure falters. She tied that point back to public trust. Trust isn't blind faith, it's earned consistency. When officials overstate and never retract, trust erodes. When trust erodes, even accurate warnings get discounted. That cycle, she suggested, is the real vulnerability adversaries exploit. The room shifted again, because this wasn't a defense of any foreign actor. It was an indictment of sloppy information culture at home. No senator could comfortably disagree with the principle. They could only hope the spotlight moved away from them. It didn't. Schiff tried to redirect the conversation toward future plans. Gabbard answered, but she anchored every answer in accountability. She spoke about restoring confidence through clarity and restraint, about explaining uncertainty rather than masking it, about correcting the record when new information emerges. She emphasized that intelligence work is not about winning arguments. It's about reducing risk. Winning arguments might help on television, but it doesn't stop real threats. In fact, it can make real threats harder to identify when everything is framed as existential. That distinction resonated because it reframed strength as discipline, not bravado. At this point, the contrast was unavoidable. Schiff sounded like someone defending a narrative. Gabbard sounded like someone defending a process. Narratives need constant reinforcement. Processes speak for themselves if they're sound. She asked one final set of questions in this phase, and they landed hard. If public officials are never required to reconcile past claims with present facts, what standard are we modeling? If intelligence language becomes a political weapon, who will trust it when it's used correctly? If oversight becomes theater, what happens when the curtain falls? And if the public stops believing any of it, who benefits? The silence after those questions wasn't dramatic, but it was heavy. No one rushed to fill it, because filling it would require acknowledging the premise. Schiff shuffled papers, as if searching for safer ground. Gabbard remained still, letting the questions hang. Sometimes the most effective move is to stop talking. As the fourth phase wound down, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer about whether Gabbard could withstand scrutiny. It was about whether the committee could withstand its own record. The power dynamic had inverted without a single raised voice. And everyone in the room knew it. Here was the uncomfortable question viewers were left with at this stage. If asking for evidence destabilizes authority more than making unsupported claims, what kind of authority have we built? Is it authority rooted in facts, or authority rooted in performance? And if it's performance, how long can it survive when the audience starts asking questions? That question lingered as the hearing moved toward its next turning point. By the time the hearing reached its fifth phase, the tension was no longer confined to the room. It had begun to spill outward into the media ecosystem that thrives on moments like this. Everyone watching could sense that something had shifted, even if they couldn't yet name it. This was no longer a test of Gabbard's composure. It was a test of how much narrative pressure could survive sustained questioning. Schiff tried to steady the pace by invoking the future. He spoke about responsibilities ahead, about guarding against emerging threats. It was a familiar move, one designed to signal leadership and reset authority. But resets only work when the audience is willing to forget what just happened. And this audience wasn't forgetting anything. Gabbard responded by acknowledging the importance of the future, then tying it firmly to the past. She argued that credibility going forward depends on honesty about what came before. You can't build trust on a foundation that no one is allowed to inspect. You can't ask people to believe the next warning if the last certainty quietly evaporated. And you can't demand confidence without offering accountability. She framed this not as a personal critique, but as an institutional challenge. Institutions survive mistakes when they admit them. They collapse when they pretend those mistakes never happened. The public, she noted, is surprisingly forgiving of error. What it refuses to tolerate is being misled and then talked down to. Schiff attempted to reassert that his record spoke for itself. Gabbard didn't argue with that phrasing. She simply asked what part of the record people were supposed to focus on. The confident statements that dominated the airwaves, or the final findings that contradicted them. And if the record includes both, which one defines credibility? That question hung in the air because it had no easy answer. You can't erase past certainty by pointing to good intentions. You can't demand trust while refusing to explain inconsistency. And you can't expect the public to sort it out silently while officials move on. Silence, after all, is no longer guaranteed. She pointed out that media amplification doesn't happen in a vacuum. It responds to authority signals, to phrases like sources say and intelligence indicates. When those phrases are used loosely, they don't just inform, they persuade. And persuasion without accountability is exactly what people mean when they say propaganda. That word made some senators shift because it's not one they like hearing applied domestically. A trace of humor surfaced again, subtle but sharp. Gabbard remarked that if narrative control were a sport, Washington would have more championships than trophies. The line landed because it poked fun without crossing into insult. Everyone in the room understood the joke, and everyone understood why it stung. Schiff pushed back, suggesting that skepticism toward intelligence claims can be dangerous. Gabbard agreed, then added that unearned certainty is just as dangerous. Skepticism asks questions, certainty shuts them down. One can coexist with democracy, the other tends to resent it. That framing flipped a common talking point on its head. She reminded the committee that intelligence work lives in probability, not prophecy. The moment probabilities are sold as conclusions, something breaks. When conclusions turn out to be wrong, the damage doesn't stay contained. It spreads into public doubt, into apathy, into reflexive disbelief. And that environment is far easier for real adversaries to exploit. This was the moment when the broader implications became impossible to ignore. The exchange wasn't just about one accusation or one hearing. It was about how often officials rely on the public's assumption of good faith. It was about what happens when that assumption erodes. And it was about whether anyone in power is willing to repair it. Schiff tried to close this segment by appealing to unity. He spoke about the need to stand together against external threats. Gabbard didn't reject the idea. She questioned whether unity built on silence is actually unity at all, or whether it's simply compliance dressed up as patriotism. She argued that real unity requires disagreement to be addressed, not suppressed. It requires officials to answer uncomfortable questions without branding the questioner as dangerous. It requires humility when certainty fails, and it requires a willingness to say, "We were wrong," out loud. Those words are rare in Washington, which is why they carried weight. The room felt quieter now, not tense, but reflective. Even senators who disagreed with her politics appeared to recognize the dilemma she was outlining. No one likes being reminded that authority is borrowed, not owned, and no one enjoys confronting the idea that borrowed authority can be revoked. But the reminder was unmistakable. As this phase ended, the narrative outside the room was already forming. Clips were being cut, quotes were being pulled, and questions were being repeated. Not partisan questions, but structural ones. Why are some claims treated as untouchable? And why does asking for evidence feel like an act of rebellion? The most controversial question lingering after this segment was also the simplest. If accountability weakens authority more than false certainty, what kind of authority have we created? Is it authority grounded in facts, or authority sustained by fear of questioning? And if questioning is the real threat, who exactly benefits from that arrangement? Those questions followed the hearing as it moved toward its final stage. As the hearing entered its final phase, the sense of inevitability was impossible to miss. This was the point where damage, if it was going to happen, would no longer be theoretical. The exchange had crossed from policy debate into a referendum on credibility. Schiff looked like someone trying to close a book whose pages had already been copied. Gabbard looked like someone prepared to let the record speak long after the room emptied. Schiff attempted a formal closing, thanking the committee and returning to procedural language. It was the tone of someone hoping structure could contain substance, but structure only works when substance cooperates. Gabbard interrupted politely but firmly, signaling that she was not done. The room froze because interruptions at that stage are never accidental. She stood, not dramatically, but deliberately. Her posture was controlled, shoulders squared, voice steady. She reminded the committee that the hearing began with a public insinuation about her loyalty. She emphasized that it was made under oath, on camera, and without evidence presented. Then she did what very few people in Washington do willingly. She summarized the exchange, not emotionally, but sequentially. Claim, question, deflection. Implication. Request for evidence, silence. She didn't add new accusations. She recapped what had already happened in plain terms. That recap hit harder than anything new could have. She asked the room to consider what Americans had just witnessed. Not a clash of ideologies, but a test of standards. She framed it as a choice between two models of leadership. One model relies on suggestion and authority. The other relies on documentation and accountability. She addressed Schiff directly, without raising her voice. She said that questioning her fitness was his right. But doing so by implying foreign compromise without evidence was not oversight. It was rhetoric masquerading as responsibility. And rhetoric like that, she argued, corrodes institutions from the inside. The questions she asked next were the kind that echo beyond the room. When officials imply the worst without proof, who is supposed to clean up the damage? When the proof never arrives, who is supposed to explain the gap? When no explanation comes, who absorbs the cost in public trust? And when trust collapses, who steps in to fill the vacuum? She paused between questions, letting them breathe. No one interrupted because interrupting would have looked like avoidance. Schiff remained silent, his notes untouched. The cameras lingered, capturing the stillness. In politics, silence at the wrong moment can be louder than a speech. Gabbard then widened her lens one final time. She spoke about service, not as a badge, but as a responsibility. Service, she said, means accepting scrutiny without hiding behind credentials. It means correcting the record when facts change. And it means resisting the temptation to trade certainty for applause. She made clear that she was not claiming infallibility. Mistakes happen in intelligence, and uncertainty is unavoidable. What matters is how leaders respond when certainty fails. Do they recalibrate and explain? Or do they double down and move on? She suggested that the country is capable of handling complexity. What it cannot handle is being treated like a problem to manage. Citizens don't expect perfection. They expect honesty. They don't demand omniscience. They demand accountability. And when those demands are ignored, skepticism becomes rational, not cynical. Her final question was delivered without drama, but it landed with weight. If asking for evidence is treated as a threat, what does that say about the system? If accountability is seen as destabilizing, what exactly is being stabilized? If authority cannot survive transparency, is it authority at all? And if not, who benefits from keeping it opaque? She concluded by stating that she welcomed oversight, real oversight, grounded in facts, not implications. She said she would answer any question backed by evidence, but she would not accept accusations built on suggestion. That line drew a visible reaction from the gallery. She sat down calmly, as if completing a briefing rather than a confrontation. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the chairman moved to close the hearing, his voice noticeably measured. Schiff did not respond further. The record, as promised, was left to stand on its own. Outside the room, the impact was immediate. Clips circulated within minutes, stripped of commentary because they didn't need it. Viewers shared the moments where questions went unanswered, not with captions, but with silence. Silence became the story. Media coverage split along predictable lines, but the questions cut across them. Even friendly outlets struggled to explain the absence of evidence behind the insinuation. Commentators argued about tone, but avoided the substance. That avoidance only amplified the core issue, because the substance was already public. The most telling reaction came from viewers who don't usually watch hearings. They didn't debate ideology. They debated standards. They asked why serious claims are so easy to make and so hard to retract. And they asked why accountability feels optional for people at the top. In the days that followed, the phrase repeated itself across platforms, not as a slogan, but as a question. Who is the real threat? The person demanding evidence, or the system that resists being asked? That question didn't belong to one party. It didn't belong to one hearing. It belonged to a political culture that has grown comfortable with implication and uncomfortable with verification. The hearing didn't answer that question conclusively. It did something more unsettling. It forced people to ask it out loud. And once a question like that enters the public conversation, it doesn't disappear quietly. It waits for the next claim, the next insinuation, the next demand for trust without proof.